Shalom and welcome to another episode in our series called Faith Journeys with God in the Land. Today we're at the site of Caesarea, a city built by Herod the Great over a 12-year span. We're going to talk about the boldness of faith and proclamation of Peter and Paul. Shalom from the reconstructed theater here at Caesarea. Caesarea was a city built over a 12-year period by Herod the Great. You can see I'm at the very high end, the bleachers, if you will, of this theater. That is pretty much reconstructed, as I mentioned, but look at how close we are to the Mediterranean. So what we're going to do in this teaching video is walk down through this theater, and I want to really share the importance as it relates to our faith walk, our faith journey with God. I want to use the examples of two guys. Peter, it's mentioned in Acts 10 being here, and also the Apostle Paul, who is mentioned here. In fact, he spent 2 years here under confinement at the Praetorium, and we'll walk over in that direction in just a moment. That story, a narrative where he shares his faith, is listed in Acts 20:26. So what we're going to do is walk this way and maybe talk a little about Caesarea. Now this site, as I mentioned, really was established by Herod the Great. He built not only the theater, a hippodrome, also the palace with even a freshwater swimming pool. Can you believe it? Out into the Mediterranean Sea. And of course the Grand Harbor, which was the biggest here in this region. We won't make it over there, although there's really nothing to see of the harbor. But when we make our way past some of these capitals that you see standing behind me, first of all, Peter. And I think this is really a great example of when Jesus predicted that in Matthew 16 that the gates of Hades will not overcome the kingdom. Remember that promise after Jesus gives his disciples the final exam question. Remember, who do you say I am? And it's Peter who responds, you are the Christ, you are the Son of the living God. And Jesus, I think, makes a prediction. The gates of Hades. I think that was a code word, an understanding among Jews, meaning Gentile cities. So when Jesus, I think, is promising that the good news of the kingdom would now extend not only to Jews but also Gentiles, I think Acts 10 is a good example of Peter's boldness, because just earlier on in that chapter 10, Peter has this vision. It's like a sheet coming down from heaven, and he's instructed to eat unkosher food. This is symbolic that now Peter was to take the good news of Christ to Gentiles. And that's what happened, because later on, as Cornelius is befriended, Peter comes here. In fact, Peter goes into his house, which was sort of a no-no for Jews to even associate that closely with Gentiles, but he does that. Of course, Cornelius thinks that Peter's a godlike figure, and he bows down, all that, and Peter basically says, hey, stand up, Cornelius, I'm only a man. But as we make our way down into the hippodrome, this is what Peter does. He shares the good news, and guess what? Cornelius becomes a believer, and he and his whole household. It's a remarkable story of transformation. The gospel now has reached into Gentile cities. So after a few years, of course, probably a few decades, Paul now shows up on the scene. There's some other biblical connections in between, but as I'm now walking in the hippodrome, this is where they had chariot races with horses, and you can see these are stone benches around the western side. This is the length of the hippodrome, and of course the well-preserved eastern benches of this hippodrome. What Paul does is, after his third missionary journey, he actually sails into the harbor here at Caesarea, and he goes to Jerusalem, takes his buddy from Ephesus, and then eventually comes here. He's under confinement for 2 years. And then what happens is that he gets a chance to defend himself. In fact, this was his heart's desire. He shares the good news of Christ, his whole testimony. Remember, this is a guy who persecuted Christians, early believers in Jerusalem. And yet Paul basically stands before a guy named Festus and Agrippa. And of course, Festus thinks that Paul's learning has driven him insane. And Paul says, no, I'm not insane. I'm a real guy. I believe in this guy named Yeshua, Jesus. He's the one who I once persecuted, but now this is the one I proclaim. And then Agrippa speaks up and he says, do you think you can persuade me to become a Christian in such a short time? And Paul says, short time or long, I pray that you and also those listening to me would become believers except for these chains. It very well could have been right where we are in this Palace Praetorium area. But what we see here in Peter and Paul is their boldness and willingness to share their faith. Now, they were countercultural because this was a culture that believed that the emperor, for instance, was one who became like a god. Think of Caesar Augustus. They honored him as a godlike person. By the way, that's the swimming pool as the extended part of the palace that Herod built way into the Mediterranean Sea, and that was a freshwater swimming pool that was enjoyed, I'm sure, not by Paul, but by the dignitaries and, of course, the family of the royalty, Herod the Great himself, and, of course, those who would follow. But can I also say that when we talk about Paul, he was one who really boldly shared his faith, and we understand how God used him. From 2 years of confinement, he would then sail to Rome. And of course, that would be a long journey. There's the Mediterranean, and now behind me, behind that barrier there, is where the ancient harbor once was located. This harbor was massive. Hundreds of boats could have been used or have used the harbor itself. In fact, Herod the Great really outdid himself because how this was built was remarkable. He dropped big pylons, big cages into the water. This was volcanic ash that when it hit the water turned to sort of like cement, and that served as the foundation of the Grand Harbor. I've snorkeled over those big cages, if you will. All there's left, of course, is the foundation of the harbor, but Josephus talks about how large it was. So But here's little Paul in relationship to this grand city, not only the harbor, but this massive city with a Temple Augustus, a theater, a hippodrome, a palace, and of course this harbor. But Paul, he remained bold. You know, his faith journey with God was intact. And he certainly was one who was used of God to share and expand this kingdom message. So boldness is something that we are to strive for. Like Peter, who shared boldly with Cornelius, and now Paul, of course, throughout his mission endeavors in Asia Minor, but even here at Caesarea, as he says, short time or long, King Agrippa, I pray that you and all who are listening to me would become believers. And this was Paul's heart and his inspiration to really be used of God in his faith journey. He would then sail to Rome and, of course, die there in the late 60s under the hand of Nero. But Paul, even up to the end, was consistent in his faith and indeed shared it boldly with anyone he could. That's really inspiring to me, looking at these two guys, and I hope it's been inspiring and encouraging to you. So when God gives you the opportunity to use words, to share the words of hope, act upon it. The Holy Spirit will give you the words and the inspiration to tell someone who is lost about the good news of Christ. So be encouraged today, and until next time, shalom.